search the web for electric guitar logo or rock music symbol, you'll most likely get images of a Fender Stratocaster. No matter how inaccurate, sketchy, or stylized they may be, you will still recognize the Stratocaster timeless design. This goes to show that this particular model embodies the purest and most literal meaning of the word icon. In fact, the Fender Stratocaster is on display at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, as a milestone in contemporary design and history. How did this happen, and why? The Stratocaster is not the first electric solid body ever produced. It's not the most eye-catching, expensive, or prestigious model. It's not even necessarily the one that sounds best. So, how did it become so popular? It all happened during a decade of unprecedented creativity and social change. This is the story of the Fender Stratocaster throughout the 1960s. We are just about to explore its tone and technical evolution and unveil how this instrument reached the status of a timeless cultural icon. Welcome back to the channel with the Cherry Sunburst frame. Bob's Stone Review, home of vintage or vintage-inspired guitar gear, guitar tone and guitar culture, always delivering original content with accurate information. Subscribe now. At the break of the 1950s, Leo Fender introduced on the market his first solid body guitars intended for Spanish playing, the Esquire and the Broadcaster, which was soon renamed Telecaster. Traditionalists perceived these instruments as oddities, mocking them as canoe paddles, snow shovels, or even toilet seats with strings. In the following years, Leo Fender devoted all his experience and efforts to designing a new guitar, one that would leave no room for mockeries. The work was carried out soliciting comments and observations from guitar players, with input from country western guitarists Bill Carson and Rex Gallion in particular. Leo himself, with collaborators George Fullerton and Freddie Tavares, are credited for the final design. The sales department chief, Don Randall, came up with the name. He wanted to present the new model as an upgrade over the Telecaster, so Stratocaster seemed an appropriate reference to a higher level, the stratosphere. The name might have been as well inspired by other models of the time, such as the 1952 Harmony Stratotone or the Stratosphere built in Missouri by the Deaver brothers. This new guitar would break definitely away from its acoustic predecessors by dictating a whole new concept specifically intended for the upcoming era of modern electrified music. Following Leo Fender's construction philosophy, everything on the new model was intended for quick assembly line production. Bolt-on neck and pre-assembled electronics mounted to the pick guard also allowed for quick servicing. Innovative features include a deep double cutaway, granting easy access to the higher frets, and a contoured body ergonomically shaped to fit comfortably around the player. 3 pickups provide broad tonal range for increased versatility. They have staggered pole pieces to compensate for the difference in output level between the individual strings. The control layout features master volume, neck pickup tone, and middle pickup tone. The bridge pickup has no tone control. The knobs are arranged for easy adjustment while playing, with the output jack comfortably angled and recessed into the body. A bridge with 6 individually adjustable saddles improved intonation over the older Fender models. However, the main innovation that led to the introduction of the Stratocaster was the addition of a built-in vibrato system to keep up with the Bixby-equipped instruments built by competitors. Fender patented a whole new design, improperly named the synchronized tremolo. In fact, Fender's nomenclature confused the term vibrato, indicating pitch variation, with the word tremolo, which refers to volume fluctuations. The headstock shape was clearly inspired by Bixby guitars, yet it evolved into a personal style, so much so that its elegance became a hallmark of the Fullerton Company. The Stratocaster hit the market in October 1954 with a list price of $249.50. At first, the new solid body didn't achieve significant commercial success, remaining confined to a niche market of country and western musicians. Over the decade, however, the Stratocaster found its way into the hands of influential pioneers of the emerging rock and roll scene, such as Ike Turner, Buddy Holly, and Ritchie Valens, so its popularity began to grow. In 1959, a brand new Fiesta Red Stratocaster crossed the Atlantic, landing in the hands of young London guitarist Hank Marvin of The Shadows. It was the first known Stratocaster to arrive in the UK, and it was destined to have a dramatic influence on the music scene of the 1960s. Over the course of the 1950s, the original design underwent only a few changes. The most important was the change in bodywood. In mid-1956, Fender switched from ash to alder, which was less expansive and had a tighter grain, allowing a quicker finishing process. In the first half of 1958, the two-tone sunburst finish gave way to a more sophisticated three-tone sunburst, featuring a third red color between the two original shades. The neck profile also underwent several changes, along with other minor variations. A major change arrived at the July 1959 NAMM show, one that would define Fender guitars throughout the following decade. Leo Fender noticed that the thin nitrocellulose lacquer on maple fingerboards would quickly show signs of play wear, with dirty spots appearing over time. Incidentally, I love vintage maple fingerboards with a naturally worn look. But of course, back then, Fender executives looked at things from a different perspective. They concluded that when showcased on TV, in photos or live performances, worn maple fingerboards looked cheap. Adopting rosewood fingerboards would solve this problem. Also, the guitar would gain a more upscale appearance, helping Fender to keep up with the elegant fingerboards sported by competitors such as Gibson and Gretsch. Therefore, following the introduction of the Jazzmaster in 1958, Fender also changed the neck construction of its other models. They switched from one-piece solid maple necks, where the neck itself was fretted and finished, to maple necks with a separate rosewood fingerboard. Early rosewood fingerboards were thick slabs, with a flat bottom glued onto the maple neck, whose surface was also milled flat. The top surface of the rosewood was then shaped to a 7.25-inch radius. This absolutely gorgeous Fender from 1960 represents the first incarnation of the Stratocaster in the new decade. It used to belong to my friend Marco, and I'd like to thank him, as well as my other collector friend Marco Gerber, for their contribution. Serial numbers are commonly found at the top of the neck plate, but some guitars from this period have them stamped on the bottom edge. The numbering was not used in a strict sequence, and it sometimes overlaps across different years. The date of the final assembly of the guitar is hand-penciled at the heel of the neck. The first two digits indicate the month, the last three digits indicate the year. The slab fretboard is made of Brazilian rosewood. This valuable wood is now very rare. At the time it was available in large quantities, so American manufacturers used it consistently until 1964. The dot markers were made with vulcanized press-cut fiberboard, which aged to a dull brownish-white color that earned the nickname of clay dot inlays. They are not actually made of clay, of course. The twin dots at the 12th fret had a wide spacing. The single-ply white pickguard of the 1950s was replaced with a 3-ply celluloid pickguard, fixed with 11 mounting screws. Over time, these pickguards naturally turned to a greenish-grey-yellow tint. Many reproductions feature a bright mint green color, failing to replicate this very distinctive hue. A little curiosity, the top hat knob in the Bob Stone Revue logo was taken from this very guitar. The original slab-board Stratocasters, produced between mid-1959 and July 1962, are in a class of their own. They usually sound truly terrific. In fact, these are by far my favorite Stratocasters. The thick Brazilian rosewood fingerboard accounts to a beefier sound with more sustain and slightly more aggressive temperament. Compared to other Stratocasters, they provide a great bridge pickup tone with highly responsive playing dynamics. The legendary Rory Gallagher's 1961 Stratocaster is the ideal example. The stock finish for the Stratocaster had been sunburst since its introduction. However, since 1956, Fender had been open to special orders for non-standard colors, borrowed from the automotive paint industry. By 1961, 14 optional finishes plus blonde were officially available for a 5% upcharge. Custom colors, or more correctly optional colors, became an important aspect of Fender marketing strategy, to the point that, to fulfill back orders, sometimes they were even applied over an existing sunburst finish. These finishing options were phased out in 1969, when managing orders became more of a nightmare than a business opportunity for Fender's sales network. Therefore, custom colors remained a hallmark of the 1960s, and a subject on which much ink has been spilled, fueling endless speculation among vintage enthusiasts. One of Leo Fender's favorite guitarists was surf rocker Dick Dale. In 1962, Dale received from Leo himself a left-handed slab-bored Stratocaster that became his faithful companion for the rest of his life. This Strat, which he nicknamed The Beast, originally had Olympic white finish and a tortoise-shell pickguard, although it was soon refinished in gold. With his unorthodox technique, Dale described himself as a manipulator rather than a guitarist, yet he showed the world what rock and roll guitar is all about. He became one of Fender's main endorsers and an absolute Stratocaster legend. In April 1962, Fender introduced a standard ink stamp on the neck heel in place of the simple hand-penciled date. The month was now indicated with a three-letter abbreviation. The first digit does not indicate the day, which in the US would normally follow the month. Instead, it's an identifying code for the guitar model. The Stratocaster was assigned the number 2. The final letter indicates the neck width. B is the standard and the most common type. For example, 2 May 62B identifies a Stratocaster neck assembled in May 1962 with a standard nut width. The slab fingerboard construction technique remained in use until July 1962. Then Fender switched to the so-called carved fingerboard. With the new method, the maple neck base was given a convex radius, and a thinner rosewood fretboard was glued on top, having uniform thickness all across. The reason of this change is that the flat joint between the slab fingerboard base and the maple neck revealed to be unstable, tending to separate when stressed by truss rod adjustments, especially when the glues of the chime were exposed to direct sunlight or heat. Although that didn't happen too often, I've seen a slab Stratocaster with the fingerboard roughly fixed with a line of nails. The carved fingerboard construction proved to be more stable. Furthermore, as the price of the Brazilian rosewood increased, the new method revealed to be an effective cost-cutting measure, allowing to save large quantities of precious fingerboard wood. As the 5 digits of the serial number on neck plates approached the end of the numerical sequence, in early 1963, Fender starts a new sequence, with the prefix letter L followed by 5 digits. The common guess is that L stands for Leo. From mid-1963, the spacing between the 2 dot markers at the 12th fret was reduced. Early 1963 Stratocasters, with the older wide dot spacing, are considered exceptional players. Some experts regarded them as the peak of Stratocaster production, built under tight quality control. A well-known example is Stevie Ray Vaughan's celebrated number 1. Even though many of its original parts were replaced over the years, it remains a honorable representative of these transitional Stratocasters produced between the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1963. In June 1964, the Rolling Stones toured for the first time in the United States. The Stones described that experience as a clash between their disruptive cosmopolitan sensibilities and the cultural backwardness of American conservative society and mainstream media. They faced abuse of power by law enforcement, TV hosts mocking their long hair.
Well, I'm going to let you in on something. You know, all these singing groups today, you're under the impression they have long hair. Not true at all. It's an optical illusion. They just have low foreheads and high eyebrows.
And puritanical censorship from radio stations. While the Stones felt a deep sense of reverence for the African American musicians from whom they had drawn inspiration, they were confronted with a narrow-minded reality where racial segregation was still in force. You weren't allowed to pee in the black man's toilet, Keith Richards recalls. Nevertheless, the time had come for a radical change. White American musicians such as Paul Butterfield, Mike Bloomfield, Alvin Bishop, the Allman Brothers, Johnny Winter, and Charlie Musselwhite soon began to attend the gigs of black musicians, discovering a whole hidden world of astounding sounds. It was the beginning of a new age of cultural cross-fertilization. Howlin' Wolf and Hubert Sumlin, Otis Rush, Buddy Guy, and Magic Sam, wielding their Stratocasters, played unlike anything ever heard before. With their outrageously bent strings and long-sustained notes, these African-American musicians were bypassing restrictive pressures, convention, and stereotypes of the conservative society. Electrified urban blues from Chicago, rhythm and blues, funk, and rock and roll were new vehicles for expression, stronger than any barriers of ethnicity and class. New fashion and musical styles spread through independent magazines and other media. As narrated by Lou Reed in his song Rock and Roll, modern solid-state radios, TVs, and jukeboxes were playing new music with an unprecedented broad diffusion. Younger generations were conquered by groundbreaking musical languages, heralds of advanced ideals of social progress and innovation. The electric guitar triggered this process. This is the cultural background and heritage of vintage guitars, as well as their historical significance. In this changing scenario of modern electrified music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other British bands of the time, such as The Animals, the Kinks, The Who, and the Yardbirds, became the biggest sensation. This phenomenon became known as the beat explosion. Almost every teenager in the Western world wanted to be in a band. They needed musical instruments, especially the fascinating American electric guitars, and especially Fenders. For a relatively small company like Fender, it was time for huge investments to increase production, meeting the growing market demand. For Leo, however, greater investment also meant greater risk, harder work, and a greater drain of his energy. As his health was screaming for attention, he decided to call it quits. He chose to sell his company to a major corporation that could manage the transition into a much larger business. On the 5th of January 1965, the contract was finalized. Leo Fender and his partner Don Randall officially sold the Fender Electric Instrument Company to Columbia Records Distribution, a subsidiary of Columbia Broadcasting System, better known as CBS, for $13 million, multiplied by 10 to get a rough estimate of the corresponding value today. This deal brings the so-called pre-CBS era to an end. Did Fender production change overnight after the CBS takeover? This beautiful Stratocaster, which carries a neck date stamp reading June 1965, gives us the answer. It still has all its original parts, apart from a professional refract. This guitar features a few changes introduced in mid to late 1964. The 1950s Fender Spaghetti logo received a restyling. This new version was used for only about 3 years, and is therefore commonly referred to as the Golden Transition logo. The clay dots were replaced by perloid dot markers. From early 1965, East Indian rosewood was introduced for fingerboards. Luckily, the Strat still has the coveted Brazilian rosewood, which can occasionally be found until later in the 1960s. The flammable greenish celluloid pickguard has now been replaced by a white ABS plastic pickguard. A thin aluminum shielding foil is glued to its underside. The pickups present some changes. The bottom of the vulcanized fiberboard bobbins switched from black to grey. My personal guess is that the grey color was chosen to make the hand-penciled dates and notes more readable. At the same time, the coating of the winding copper wire changed from orange heavy foam var to brownish purple plain enamel. To save paint, the red band of the three-tone sunburst was not sprayed in the area beneath the pickguard. Also, the Cruson tuners underwent a small cosmetic change. The brand, previously stamped on the shell in a single line, is now arranged in 2 parallel lines, one reading Cruson and the other Deluxe. It's interesting to note that these changes are commonly seen by vintage collectors as the dividing line between pre-CBS and CBS production. However, they were not introduced by the new CBS management. They were implemented in mid to late 1964 by Leo Fender himself. More importantly, they were largely cosmetic changes. They were certainly not cost-cutting measures affecting the manufacturing quality or performance of the instruments. Returning to our initial question, did Fender production change overnight after the CBS takeover? The short answer is no. This June 1965 Stratocaster is identical to the last Stratocasters that left the Fullerton factory before CBS executives even walked in. Furthermore, it's not even substantially different from those made a couple of years before. Changes were gradual and phased in over time. Old stock parts were used alongside the new ones. Nothing went to waste. On the 25th of July 1965, at the Newport Folk Festival in Rhode Island, Bob Dylan walked up on stage with a Stratocaster strapped on, backed for the very first time by a full-blast electric band. According to official rock historiography, Dylan's electric set scandalized an audience of folk purists who considered this novelty a heresy and buried him under shouts and boos. This version fits the stereotype of a traditionalistic folk audience booing a transgressive rocker. Actually, more recent accounts suggest that it was a negative reaction to Dylan's loud and messy soundcheck that rudely disturbed the performances of other artists.
Gentlemen, no noise now. We gotta make the mic check. It is essential that you get your levels for your instruments and for your amplifiers and get them into your heads.
Either way, this legendary three-song set marked a turning point in both rock and folk music. Dylan left that Stratocaster behind on a private flight. It resurfaced in 2005 when the pilot's daughter, Dawn Peterson, released what had been sitting in her attic for 40 years.
For more than 40 years, this guitar has been in my family. My dad was a private pilot for Bob Dylan. The guitar was left on one of his planes and he took it home.
This historic 1964 Stratocaster, in time capsule condition, sold at auction for $965,000. It's often said that today we live in a paradox. Vintage guitars are expected to look pristine, while new instruments are expected to look worn straight out of the shop. I love vintage instruments in player-grade condition. Vintage players' instruments are authentic. They have real vibe, real stories to tell, and, in most cases, better tone. Furthermore, they can be actually played in public without the anxiety of adding wear to a pristine collector's item. This great Stratocaster from 1966 is a perfect example. In the 70s, the original Sunburst received a black cover spray. As often happens, the Transition logo lost much of its gold pigment. However, all its original parts are still in place, and this guitar delivers highly expressive playing dynamics. Its playwear tells a lot about its glorious past. Over the years, it passed through the hands of two musicians of my hometown, Angelo Ruggiero and Pietro Matarrese. On this guitar we find the first real changes introduced by CBS in late 1965. First, Fender enlarged the peghead to improve branding. This wide headstock was used throughout the 1970s. The serial number sequence on the neck plate continued with 6-digit numbers, starting at 100,000, without the L prefix. Also, a large F Fender logo was stamped below the serial number. Under the pick guard, we still find the original finish and body markings. I've seen stripped bodies from this period made from as many as 6 well-matched pieces. The Stratocaster model code was changed from 2 to 13. The next date is June 1966. Throughout the vintage era, the switch had 3 positions, selecting only one pickup at a time. Players found that by balancing the switch between detent positions, they could activate 2 pickups together, producing more tones. As a result, the 5-way switch became a widely popular modification, until it was officially introduced in 1977. Believe it or not, by 1967, the Stratocaster had not yet reached the expected commercial success. In fact, Fender considered the Jazzmaster and the Jaguar as their flagship models, and a lot of effort was put into the production and promotion of the new Coronado. It's rumored that the Stratocaster might have been even discontinued, and it's a fact that its production dropped dramatically that year. There is a peculiarity in 1967 production that is not often disclosed in vintage literature. An old bin of pre-CBS black-bottom pickup bobbins resurfaced. Therefore, in some 1967 Stratocasters are found black-bottom pickups. They usually have a yellow and green wire. However, these pickups carry 1967 dates, so they were arguably wound in that year with plain enamel insulation and should not be considered pre-CBS pickups. When I was younger, I could not understand why my 1967 Telecaster had black bottom pickups, even though they were obviously original. It took a while to find out. Also, some rare Stratocasters from this period have a bound neck. On the 12th of May 1967, a London-based 3-piece band released its debut album. This band was fronted by a young guitarist from Seattle, whose name was Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix hit the 1960s music scene like an asteroid, and suddenly all the dinosaurs went extinct. On the 18th of June, Jimi was introduced to America at the Monterey Pop Festival. He seemed to come from another world. This performance ended with one of the most iconic moments in rock history. He gestured to the audience to cover their ears, then set his Stratocaster on fire before smashing it into pieces. Hendrix changed the perception of the Stratocaster forever, and it has been said that, in fact, he sold more Stratocasters than all the Fender salesmen put together. The Stratocaster never went out of production. In 1968, Fender started for the first time to look back at its glorious past and officially reintroduced the maple fingerboard as an option. I have discussed this topic in detail in one of my early videos, episode BTR number 7. Jimmy's preference for maple fingerboards also played a part in the comeback of maple necks. This Stratocaster, with 1969 features, represents the last incarnation of the Stratocaster in the 1960s. Although, by the time Fender was introducing polyurethane finishes, this guitar still retains the beautiful nitrocellulose lacquer. I asked my Luther friend Michele Dalbis to remove some later touch-ups, as I much prefer the look of honest playwear. This Stratocaster presents a few changes introduced between 1967 and 1968. For an even bolder branding, the golden logo was restyled in black lettering outlined in gold, which is known as the Black Logo. The nickel-plated cloisons were discontinued, replaced by chrome-plated keys known as F-tuners.
Bought me a Stratocaster, a blast-faced standard twin.
The white pickguards from 1968 to 1969 have a peculiarity, a perloid bottom layer. They were probably made by flipping leftover perloid pickguard material. As often seen in the late 1960s, this guitar doesn't have a yellow primer. The central area of the three-tone sunburst is simply natural wood color. The Stratocaster model code was changed again from 13 to 22. Alongside the usual neck-heel stamp, Fender introduced, on some guitars, a different type of neck stamp, in smaller lettering and green ink, as seen on this guitar. This numeric sequence is quite inconsistent and obscure. It probably identifies production batches. Sometimes a date code is reported, while some guitars from late 1969 or very early 1970, like this one, bear a 202 code, which, to my knowledge, has yet to be deciphered. Built in the 5th year of CBS management, 1969 Stratocasters are revered as the ultimate tool for Hendrik Stone. In fact, that's what he used in his live shows. The Stratocaster is no exception. I don't hesitate to define it as a tone king, one that really stands out in terms of sound. Surprisingly, it sounds more resonant than many older Strats. It's the type of inspiring guitar that, once you start playing, you simply cannot put down. In fact, the 1969 Stratocaster still has a lot in common with its older sisters, and can rightfully be defined as the last representative of the golden age of Fender production. It still retains the 4-bolt neck joint, the original bent steel bridge saddles with the Fender patent-pending stamp, and the heavy steel sustain block. in the tremolo cavity, an important part for tone. In the following years, the Stratocaster would progressively drift away from its original concept. Several unwelcome changes were introduced, such as the micro-tilt neck with a 3-bolt joint, leather zinc sustain blocks, pickups with fully automated winding and flat polypieces, heavier woods with a thick polyurethane finish, shallower contours, less refined necks, and so on. As the 1960s came to an end, so did an entire era. And this era ends with an image: Jimi Hendrix on stage at the Woodstock Festival denouncing the horrors of Vietnam War, brandishing his Fender Stratocaster. This video is completely self-funded and independent, so please check out my web links and consider supporting my channel by a small donation through my PayPal link. You can also check out my page of recommended Thomann gear and shop through my affiliate link at no additional cost to you. A couple of book suggestions if you are interested to know more about vintage Stratocasters. The Stratocaster Chronicles by Tom Wheeler, published by Hall Leonard. Fender Telecaster and Stratocaster by Dave Hunter, published in Italy by my friends of Volonté and Company. And for a technical approach, the Fender Stratocaster Manual by Paul Ballmer, also published in Italy by Volonté and Company. Shoot all your comments below, subscribe now and hit the bell to stay in touch.